Welcome to our next training video in the 1 Corinthians series. This is our last training video in chapter 16, which is really a summary of the entire letter. And you'll notice this as you look at the leader's notes. Even as we go through, you'll find there are little reminders about the entire letter from chapters 1 to 15. So it's worthwhile. Go through the notes, see how all these threads are being pulled together in chapter 16 and its relevance for us today. But let's get into the passage. And just remember the context as Paul ended his discussion on the resurrection, which was such a key chapter in this letter, is the conclusion really is stand firm in your faith. So the faith and hope that you've received, give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because if the resurrection is true, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And really this is what he's been encouraging them in all along. And the rest of chapter 16 is really some practical applications of giving yourselves fully to the work of the Lord and your labor in the Lord. And these various things are not in vain. So getting into it, the first thing he writes about in verses 1 to 9 is to be generous to the mission, particularly proclaiming Christ crucified in the church and to the nations. And the first thing he talks about is verses 1 to 4. You'll pick this up in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 to 9 as well. There's lots of references to this whole idea of the collection for the Church of Jerusalem in the book of Acts. You can go look in their leaders' notes. But basically, in summary, here we see a little bit of an insight in how they raised funds to support the Church of Jerusalem and the various things that are going on there. Especially now because whereas they sacrificially sent out people to share the good news, they're in trouble now. And the call is to sacrificially help them in return. And so this is the strategy. On the first day of every week, so that's a Sunday basically, each one of you should set aside a sum of money. So save, notice, in keeping with your income, what you can, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. So this lump sum. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve. Remember in chapters 1 to 4, they're already skeptical about their leaders. And so Paul wants to ensure that the collection of money and the sending of that money, this gift to Jerusalem, is done with integrity. And even so, he might even go and accompany them as well. The men they approve. And hopefully you can see how Paul highlights and emphasizes integrity in the dealing with finances, particularly for the support of the church in Jerusalem. But he also wants support for himself. Verses 5 to 9. After I go through Macedonia, I come to you, for I will be going through Macedonia. Notice this, perhaps I'll stay with you for a while, or even spend the winter, but a furlough. Why? So that you can help me, or send me on my journey wherever I go. And when you read the letters of Paul and the book of Acts, this sending of Paul and helping him is basically three things: funds, food, and friends. Friends like Titus, Timothy, and Luke, and others, which he writes about, or John Mark. And really what he's saying is, you, Corinthian church, in chapter 9, you received the gospel freely. And really what Paul is calling them here is to partner with him in the gospel, so the gospel can go out and be offered freely to others who have not received it yet. So being changed from a receiver to a partner in the gospel. And to do that, we need to be generous. But then he moves on to the big issue they had in chapters 1 to 4, which is leaders. And really what he's saying to them is support your leaders in the mission. In verses 10 to 12 and 15 to 18. Firstly, regarding two leaders that Paul wants to send, Timothy. So when Timothy comes, don't see him as a lobbyist for Paul. Notice this. Don't quarrel about him. Don't judge him. Don't fight about him. No one then should treat him with contempt. He's doing the work of the Lord. He's a fellow worker, just as I am, just as Apollos is. So don't judge him. Don't treat him with contempt. Don't reject him. And when he goes, send him on his way in peace. So really, apply what I've been teaching you in chapters 1 to 4. And then regarding Apollos, who they have been arguing about, he's actually pointing out they're working together. I strongly urge them to go with the brother, go to you with the brothers. But notice this, he was quite unwilling to go now. It's quite interesting, whereas they actually out of touch with the leaders they're lobbying for. He is aware of what's going on. Unlike Paul, He's quite unwilling to go, but Paul wants to go to sort out the mess and make them a sending, supporting, mission-minded church. Those are the leaders he wants to send, Timothy and Apollos. But then he moves on to talk about leaders that are actually already there. Fantastic leaders, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaeus. Unique about these names, by the way, is that they're Greek and Roman. And when he talks about the household of Stephanas, they're all devoted together in the service of the Lord's people. And so how should you respond to leaders like this who are with you already? Notice this: submit to such people and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. Don't resist the work of the Lord. Join your leaders, support your leaders in the work of the Lord and everyone else who is involved in it. And notice, rather than treating them with contempt, judging them, quarreling about them, dismissing them, fighting about them, notice how he ends: such men deserve recognition, to be honored, to be respected, to be obeyed and followed. Now notice, Paul's not calling for blind obedience, but also he's not calling us to treat people with skepticism and contempt who are seeking to serve the Lord and lead us in the service of the Lord. We should honor them. Yes, we keep them accountable, but that does not negate the idea of submitting and following and joining in the labor. So support your leaders in the mission. And then in the middle, a beautiful summary of our faith, hope, and love, as we've already picked up since chapter 13. Be on your guard when you do the mission. Do it all in love. Be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous and strong in your faith and your hope. And let that empower you to do everything in love, which is a little summary of chapter 13. And so if you want to know more about what he means by this, you just go back to chapter 13. But ultimately, the entire labor of the Lord, working together, being generous, supporting your leaders, joining in the work of the Lord, all of it needs to be done in love. Because as Paul said, without love, it means nothing. But strikingly is how this letter closes. And this is just what I want to highlight. Notice this. Apart from the fact that he's been calling us continually to love one another, notice how he ends. The idea of glorifying God has been emphasized the whole time. He says, if anyone does not love the Lord, because remember, throughout the letter, there's been people who have basically rejected Jesus as Lord. They're living their own way, their own lifestyles. They don't care. Notice what he says: let that person be cursed. Whoever does not recognize Jesus as Lord and lives in the service of him in faith, hope, and love, let that person be accursed. Because ultimately, the heart of the Christian is come, Lord. And so remember 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 to 2, and 15, verses 1 to 11. This is our faith and our hope. And without these things, they mean nothing. And really what you want your people to walk away with is to see the correlation between what Paul has previously written and these final instructions. These final instructions are not without context. And really they're pulling all the threads together from the rest of the letter. But also see the relationship between the church and leaders. We're not supposed to be rebels. Yes, we should keep our leaders accountable, but we're supposed to be followers and doers of the mission in support of our leaders, joining our leaders, following them in the mission. But also be challenged, each and every one of us personally, to reform ourselves in accordance with the gospel. If we want to commit ourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because that's the only thing that's not in vain, then a lot of changes need to happen in our own lives. And in many ways, this will lead us into the commitment series, which is about impossible commands. And that, I would say, in a nutshell, is how we end our time together in 1 Corinthians.